studying women's history at Brown is not probably going to get you anywhere, but when you say Phyllis Schlafly sent you, they actually answer your calls. So that's how I came about these 100 women. Okay, so I'm interviewing these women, and they're learning in the current events dialogue group about New York State legalizing abortion, which they're opposed to for both personal reasons and religious reasons. And they're very alarmed to find out that the party of the New Deal, that some of the leading Democrats in the state are coming on board with this. This has a lot to do with internal dynamics in the Democratic Party, but I don't want to get too into the weeds with this, but essentially in the late 60s you have a lot of young staffer, anti-Vietnam War young people who had joined Gene McCarthy's anti-war campaign, and they're furious that Humphrey ended up being nominated, who was sort of status quo in Vietnam. So at the convention, the 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago, where everything was literally burning outside the doors of the building, you have these young staffers who say, how can we get different delegates in the room when it's the 1972 presidential election? We want delegates, not these old union bosses who like the Vietnam War because it's good for jobs. We want different delegates who are going to be against the Vietnam War. So they decide to change the rules in the Democratic Party, whereby 10% of the country is African American. They decide 10% of the delegates should be African American. They look at different demographics and they do it along that lines, knowing that men who are not white were disproportionately impacted by the draft. And so if you get more delegates who are less white, they would potentially in 72 not nominate a pro-war Humphrey. They also thought that women are 51% of the population, but these were young guys, and they said, oh, that would be too much to have 51% of the delegates be women. So we'll have 30% be women. And so on. The whole idea was women must be against the war because they're for peace. And so, this would be a way not to get a Humphrey-like figure nominated in 1972. Well, that meant by 1972, by the 70s, the Democratic Party was trying to bring more women, at least 30%, into the party. And the only women in politics then, this is before Schlafly got organized, were feminists. Well, if 30% of your party is essentially, of your leadership is going in delegate base, are going to be women, and the only women in politics in that era are feminists, this is how the party of the New Deal starts to become the party of modern feminism. The Republican Party doesn't really have the same internal dynamics that is openly welcome women into the party. Okay? But like I said, the Republican Party was on board with many of the aims of modern feminism because of their penchant towards individual rights and small government, which you see most clearly in the abortion debates. So these women are looking, they're sitting in this dialogue group, and they're realizing that their party of the New Deal is starting to welcome feminists who support legal abortion into it. And as one woman said, quoting an obscure author, we were supposed to be the party that distributed hats, not cut off heads. That's how she put it, seeing that transition. Pretty dramatic quote, right? Meanwhile, they were not happy with the Republicans in the state, because at the time of the 1970s, the Republican Party was led by Rockefeller, who also supported legal abortion. So they start this dialogue group in their church, and they go off and eventually form the New York State Republican Right to Life Party. Okay. And their idea is they start running candidates for election, not because they think they can win, but they're trying to show both the Democratic and Republican parties that there's a very viable anti-abortion swing vote in the state to try to move them in that direction. Okay. They're not winning races, but they see themselves as potentially shifting the dialogue. At least that's the hope for many of them. So these women are sort of without a party, without a home in either the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. And along comes, they finally find someone who is interested in partnering with them, the conservative wing of the Republican Party in New York State, which have been out of power since Hoover. And Rockefeller literally dominates the party. His form of moderate politics forms it, and moderate Rockefeller Republicans are supporting legal abortion and modern feminism. But conservatives really are based, I'm going to show you a map of the state. Here. Essentially the way that the way that partisan politics worked in this era, the 1960s, 1970s in New York State, is you have the major population center, New York City, which is mostly dominated by the Democratic Party and moderate Republicans, and they sort of fight for space in New York City. Meanwhile, upstate New York, which is actually every single county except those 4 suburban ones I talked about, and New York City, the 5 counties of New York City, that's all considered upstate, whether it's Orange County, New York, or actual upstate. And it was sparsely populated, and that's where conservative Republicans had their base. Of course, there weren't that many voters, so they were in, even though it was a large geographic portion, and so they were largely out of influence in the state. They were looking to finally take over influence from the moderates, right there in Rockefeller's home district. So they looked to the suburbs, the growing suburbs of New York City, where you have this influx of activism led by Catholic women against issues like abortion. And they said, I know how we can get a population base in the state. Let's link our conservative politics to this growing anti-feminist politics. And you see that happening in the state. If we can win over voters that these women are organizing, then we might have a chance of actually not only minimizing the moderates in our state, but because these counties are so populous, we might even win a statewide election. And it's sort of in this moment that those like Reagan are looking to New York State as a swing state, as I was saying, because they see that conservatives are linking their politics to this new family values coalition. Remember, conservatives had at first been supportive of policy aims of the feminist movement. Ronald Reagan himself did legalize abortion as governor of California in 1967. Again, they saw this as perfectly, just like moderate Republicans saw feminist aims like legal abortion as perfectly consistent with Republican ideology, so too did conservative Republicans. They were for the ultimate in a small state. They were vigorously for individual rights, both which mesh well with the orientation toward the pro-choice orientation, right? Of a woman should decide, not the state. So conservatives at first were, okay with feminist aims, but when they saw that right there in the heart of Rockefeller's New York, women were organizing who had left the Democratic Party and were organizing against abortion. They decided that we could just marry our politics to their politics and actually win votes. That's how you get this kind of odd coalition of small government conservatives who are for big government in terms of issues like abortion, having the state sort of decide versus an individual woman. It's an odd marriage, but it's a marriage of political convenience that you really see starting to first take shape in a place like New York State in the 70s, thanks to the activism of these women. And it becomes family values conservatism. Again, why are they interested in this? I mean, not only are they opposed to abortion, but just generally they perceive modern feminism as antithetical to their lifestyles, right? I told you that they had seen being a homemaker. They were first-generation suburbanite, first-generation homemaker. They saw that as the prize. And right when they had achieved that prize that their mothers and their working-class grandmothers had always hoped for, from their perspective, along came modern feminism with language about a choice. A woman should be able to choose, should she stay at home or should she go out into the paid workforce? They felt that by advocating a choice, you were in effect diminishing the choice to stay at home, because if it really were the ultimate prize as they saw it, why would you need a choice, right? It's basic supply and demand. More choices, less value to any one single choice, right? So it was not just abortion, but it was just in general this idea of making women more competitive outside of the home that didn't sit right with them. And as conservative Republicans sort of spoke to that as a ploy to get their votes, the votes that they were organizing, they started to find a home in the Conservative Party. And so by 1980, as I was saying at the beginning, you end up with a Republican Party that is looking to finally rout out the last vestiges of pro-feminist, moderate Rockefeller Republicanism right there in Rockefeller's home state. Of course, Rockefeller passed away in 1979, but it was still his state party. And it's this calculus that sets Reagan's campaign sights on New York State in 1980, and as I said, even is behind his decision to appoint prominent New Yorkers to his campaign staff. So maybe I'll just leave it. So that's really the transition that you really see in my book, this narrative of the women first observing their party of the New Deal, becoming the party of modern feminism, that making them feel like they no longer have a home in that party, and not at first looking to the Republican Party, which was dominated by moderate, pro-feminist Rockefeller Republicans, but seeing this sort of marginal conservative force welcome them into their arms in this sort of tenuous, not natural coalition, but one that ultimately allows Reagan to win the state, not once but twice. And ever since then in New York, and I said this is a case study that speaks to broader trends, these were the voters that were called Reagan Democrats. They're the voters that switch parties in any one given election, and they, and especially women, like in this book, the demographic 45 to 64, because those are the folks who go to the polls, women in that age bracket, more than any other voters in America, they really have become the coveted swing vote in national elections, federal elections, and below, right? Sometimes we call them the soccer moms today. Lots of different labels, but this is sort of the origin point of that. So again, I'm happy to take your questions. I look forward to it. And if you're interested in the book, because my publisher would be very upset if I did not say this, I do have some coupons from University of Pennsylvania Press for 20% off, or if you'd like the even deeply discounted author rate, you can buy it for $35. You can leave your contact information there, your name, how many you want in your email, and I can get it to you in the Bridgewood area. Thank you, everyone.